Ruthless Compassion is a podcast that shows you how to become fiercely kind. I'm the host, Dr. Marcia Sirota, and in each episode, I get into it with experts and regular folks about the things that get in the way of what we want. Things like addiction and mental health, isolation and loneliness, difficult family and work relationships, and the importance of self-care. I want to help you overcome the obstacles to living your best life, and I want to inspire you to become a powerful kindness warrior. Dr. Mark Goulston is a psychiatrist and one of the foremost thought leaders in the area of listening and empathy, with his book, Just Listen, becoming the top book on listening in the world, and with his recent book, Talking to Crazy, How to Deal with Irrational and Impossible People in Your Life, also becoming an international bestseller, especially in Russia, where its title is How to Talk with A-Holes. He is also one of the leading experts on suicide prevention, and he co-created and moderated the multi-award-winning documentary, Stay Alive, an intimate conversation about suicide prevention. He also hosts My Wakeup Call, a podcast where he interviews influencers about what is most important to them and their wake-up calls in arriving at that. Welcome, Dr. Mark Goulston, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I just finished reading your book, Talking to Crazy, How to Deal with the Irrational and Impossible People in Your Life, and I was very inspired, but also slightly daunted by the book because it's a wonderful topic and very important, but it seems like it's a little bit challenging to do some of the things that you're recommending. Could you maybe tell me how you decided to write this book and, what you're hoping for having put it out into the world?
Well, I'm a psychiatrist and I've actually retired, but I was a psychiatrist for 40 years and I was a suicide specialist for 25 years and none of my patients killed themselves. And I wrote a book called Just Listen prior to this book. And Just Listen is a book about how do you listen into people and cause them to feel felt, which is different than feeling understood. And when people feel felt, they feel less alone. They cry with relief. They feel better. They start to be able to have a regular conversation with you. But there were two chapters in Just Listen that got a lot of attention in interviews. And one of them was Steer Clear of Toxic People. And another chapter was how to go from OF to OK. So how to calm yourself down. And as I looked out in the world, it seemed like there was a lot of people that seemed to drive other people crazy. So talking to crazy is not about mental illness. And what's interesting is I got a lot of pushback because people would say, how can you write a book called Talking to Crazy when we're trying to destigmatize mental illness?
Right. So how could you?
Well, I said, first of all, it's about dealing with the people who drive you crazy. And the title is such that when I would say to people, I'm thinking of writing a book called Talking to Crazy, people immediately smiled. And I'd say, what are you smiling about? They say, I think I do that every day. And then people would say, what if the crazy person is yourself? Oh, yeah, we have a chapter, we have a section on that. And so the idea is it's a catchy title, so hopefully people will read, but what they'll hopefully get from it, it's actually more about how do you get through to people who are acting up through empathy, through connecting with them. And so I went on to write Talking to Crazy. And here's the crazy thing about it. It's in Russian, and the Russian edition is called How to Talk with A-Holes, and it went viral. And I'm going to Moscow in 3 weeks to headline with a Nobel Prize winner named Daniel Kahneman. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And I said, what are you having me there speaking with a Nobel Prize winner? And they said, he may be a Nobel Prize winner, but his book didn't go viral.
So why do you think it went viral?
Well, because I think, first of all, it's a catchy title, and their title, How to Talk with A-Holes. I think people deal with that every day. I advise a lot of businesses these days, and I've done surveys, and I've said, what is more stressful to you? Too much work or really difficult people that drive you crazy? And there was a 3-to-1 answer of 3-to-1 difficult people versus too much work. And I think what it is difficult people make us crazy, stress us out, make us take poor care of ourselves. For your listening audience, something that I think will make them chuckle, but it's not funny, is I remember reading research that more than 50% of people fall off a diet or exercise after they've had a close encounter of the worst kind, after they have had to deal with someone who made them crazy, they go off the diet. They stop exercising. I think a lot of people face this. And really, I think why Talking to Crazy is caught on, and I hope to give your listeners practical tips that they can use today, is people don't avoid these confrontations because they want to avoid them. They don't know what to do. What are steps? What are actual tactics that you can use that can turn an argument into a breakthrough in your relationship? So hopefully we'll cover some of those.
Yeah, I think that's super important, because I think that when I read in the book, you talk about the amygdala hijack, or that the part of the brain that experiences fight or flight or freeze, and how easy it is for us when we're encountering somebody who's irrational to just go into that mode, and then we stop being rational and we can't respond in a way that's constructive.
Yeah, absolutely. So, here's a little neurochemistry, which, won't be lost on you, but hopefully your listeners will find it a little interesting, is that when we're under stress, there's big release of cortisol from our adrenal glands. Cortisol helps us deal with stress. But when the cortisol goes high, it triggers this part of our brain called the amygdala, and the amygdala is in our emotional brain. And it really triggers our amygdala to shunt blood into our lower reactive brain, our reptile fight or flight brain, and away from our thinking brain. And so when it does that, that's called an amygdala hijack. And something that I really wasn't aware of, but I've become very aware of, is the antidote to high cortisol and an amygdala hijack is oxytocin. And oxytocin is the bonding hormone. It's what allows moms to bond with screaming babies. Instead of throwing them out the window, oxytocin comes out, and oxytocin counters high cortisol and calms people down. And by the way, one of the reasons I believe that women live longer than men is that when both are under stress, when a man is under stress, he withdraws from people because he gets a little bit paranoid. He's under stress, he feels threatened. And he withdraws and he comes up with a plan, and then he comes back and he attacks the problem. But throughout all of that, the cortisol is high, whereas women instinctively know that if they can get their emotions out, if they can feel felt, if they can feel a surge of oxytocin, that what will happen is that seems to reverse the high cortisol. And that's why, by the way, when feminine energy wants to be felt, because when you feel felt and your oxytocin is high, what happens is cortisol goes down, the amygdala relaxes, and blood flow goes back up to our upper brain, and you can have a conversation. Now, what happens with masculine problem-solving energy is it thwarts that. It gives you advice and a solution to try and put a lid on all that emotionality, and it just makes the situation worse.
That's so fascinating, and it makes so much sense. And I'm so delighted to hear that there is an actual neurochemical basis to this, and how oxytocin actually dampens down the cortisol. And that's why when you get a hug, when you're all stressed, you feel better.
Absolutely. I'm going to tell you a story that I hope your listeners love it as much as you're going to. There is a woman, a friend of mine, she says, I'm having an issue with my husband. My husband says that I blither too much, and he's absolutely right. But here is the issue. People love me, and they think my husband's a bit of a stiff. He's very smart. He's kind of an engineer type. He's very honest, but you can't connect to him. And so when we get into these arguments, they escalate, and he either shuts down or he stares at me like a deer in the headlights, and I get worse. And so is there anything that I can do? So we'll call her Joan and her husband Jack. And I said, Joan, here's some reverse psychology. And what you're going to do is you're going to do an oxytocin hijack. I said, the next time you have an argument, and she says, she admitted that she often leads the arguments and she's upset about something. And he stares at her. I said, what I want you to do the next time is you have to stop yourself when he's staring at you that way. And you say, Jack, I think I have a way through this that's better than we usually do. Now he's going to be really happy because he thinks, oh, the argument's over. Let's go eat. Let's go have wine. Maybe we'll have sex later tonight. So he's great. But what you say is, no, I have a way to make this better. So just play along with me. And then I said, look into Jack's eyes and say to him, reverse psychology. I said, say to him exactly these words. Jack, I want you to look at me and say these words. Joan, when we get into an argument and you get overly emotional and whatever I say is wrong and whatever I don't say is wrong, you make me want to run full speed and smash my head into the wall. And then 3 days later, she calls me. She says, I had a chance to use it. I said, what happened? She said, we were having an argument. And I said, Jack, I want you to say that to me. Joan, when we get into an argument and you get all emotional and whatever I say is wrong, whatever I don't say is wrong, it makes me crazy, basically. Could you say that to me, honey? And he was kind of reluctant. And I told her to keep coaxing him. And she said she kept coaxing him to say it. She said, come on, just try it. Just try saying the word. And she said he started to talk to her and he spoke for 5 minutes, getting things off his chest about his mother, about his life, about everything. And everything just felt better. And she said to me, there's good news and bad news. I said, what was the good news? She said, the good news is it really worked. It just totally got all his emotions off his chest, and he's not in touch with his emotions. And like you said, I didn't get defensive. I was just pulling his emotions out of him. I said, what's the bad news? And she said, afterwards, he comes up to me. He hugs me. He says, you're my best friend. I love you. You're wonderful. She says, he's like a puppy dog. He won't let me alone. He's hugging me. He's rubbing my shoulders. He's creeping me out. I said, don't worry, it'll go back, but at least you have a tool to use. But what happens is she gave him a surge of oxytocin by inviting him to vent those feelings and her accepting them. And she said it was unbelievable.
You know, when I was reading your book, a lot of the tools that you give are kind of counterintuitive. And like you say, they're empathy based, and they give the other person the opportunity to really talk about the darkest fears and thoughts and feelings that they have. And I find that most of us put up a wall to that kind of stuff. Like, we really don't want to hear it. So when someone is behaving irrationally, even if the irrational is just being super cold and analytical, we just don't want to give them any space to have those kinds of thoughts and feelings. And the thing I love about your book is that you really invite people to share the darkest thoughts and feelings and urges that they might have, and then give them a chance to express them in a way that's not harmful. And I really think that that's just fantastic.
Well, thank you. So we have time because I want to share a story from my suicide work, which taught me how to do all of this. Can I share a story?
Absolutely.
So I was a suicide specialist for many years, and one of my earliest mentors was a fellow named Dr. Ed Schneidman. He was, if not he was one of the pioneers in the study of suicide, and he was at UCLA, and he used to refer me these still suicidal patients who had to be discharged because they weren't acutely suicidal, but nobody wanted to see them. And so he was a mentor, and he referred them to me. And there was one patient that I'll call Nancy, and Nancy had made 3 or 4 suicide attempts, had been in the hospital 3 months every year for the prior 5 years. And so I was seeing Nancy, and I was making, I thought, 0 progress. She'd come in, she wouldn't speak, she really wouldn't make eye contact. And I was seeing her for 6 months, and I thought, I'm not really helping her, but that was the longest she'd gone without a hospitalization or a suicide attempt. And then one Monday, I see her after I had been working at a hospital, moonlighting, and you know what moonlighting is. You work and cover for other doctors. So I had been up 36 hours. And when I was with Nancy, I'm in the room on a Monday, and I look out at the room, and she's not looking at me, and all the color in the room turns to black and white. So I'm looking out at the room, and it's black and white. And then I feel these chills go through me. And I thought I was having a stroke or a seizure. And so I did a neurologic exam on myself. I'm looking at my finger in front of me, see if I have double vision. And it wasn't rude because she wasn't looking at me. And then I realized I'm not having a stroke or a seizure. And I had this crazy thought, and my more evidence-based colleagues who spoiled the story said, well, Mark, you had a dissociative episode, but the heck with them. I had this crazy idea that I was looking at the world and feeling what she felt, feeling it was cold and chilly. And because I was sleep deprived, I blurted this out to her. Nancy, I didn't know it was so bad, and I can't help you kill yourself. But if you do, I will still think well of you, and maybe I'll understand why you had to get out of all the pain. And I thought, I just gave her permission to kill herself. I'm in a mess. And she looked at me for the first time, and I thought she was going to say, thank you for understanding, I'm overdue. And I said, what are you thinking, Nancy? And she looked at me, and she held onto my eyes, and she said, if you can really understand why I might have to kill myself to get out of the pain, maybe I won't need to. And then she smiled. And what I said to her, and I think this is part of why my track record was pretty good. Now, I don't practice. I teach other people how to do this. What I said to her as I'm looking into her eyes is, Nancy, this is what we're going to do. I'm not going to give you treatment suggestions or things that you're not going to follow up on because you've tried everything. And I kept looking in her eyes, and I said, I'm going to find you wherever you are, and I'm going to keep you company there as long as it takes, because you've been there alone too many times at 3 a.m, and I just don't want you to be alone anymore. And she started to cry. And so a lot of my approaches Just Listen is a book about how do you cause people to feel felt. And that experience with Nancy was the pivotal, probably clinical experience of my life. And so now I'm teaching people, how do you listen into people? And when you listen into people, or when you connect with people and talking to crazy, I mean, when you're not judgmental and you're receptive to whatever they're saying, they calm down.
Yeah, that's a very moving story.
Thank you. Thank you. I thank you for allowing me to tell it.
Getting to this, all your ideas about how to deal with these difficult, irrational people. I have a question for you, and it's completely self-serving, but I figured now that I have you as a captive audience, I can ask you this based on your ideas of talking to irrational people. One of the things that I come across, and I'm only doing a couple of days a week as a psychotherapist these days as well, but I have some patients who really have a very strong inner critic in their head. And sometimes they're able to push it off, and sometimes it just gets so loud and they're almost debilitated by the constant negative self-talk. So what would be your approach to someone who walked into your office one day and said, my inner critic is just tearing strips off me. I can barely function because all I can do is just have this argument with them constantly. How would you talk to crazy with somebody like that?
Well, I would ask them, what happened to you, and don't edit it, what happened to you that has led you to have an inner critic? Have you always had an inner critic? Or did you learn it from someone else? And what you want them to do is to tell you actual episodes that may have led to it. Probably a critical parent, or they watched a parent criticize the other parent, whatever it is. Because what happens is when someone can tell you about an episode that you can see clearly with your eyes, they re-experience the feelings. And people make transformations internally, not through insight, but through re-experiencing feelings and making an internal shift. So I would draw out of them, what happened to you that you started developing this inner critic, and then see what they say. I remember seeing a patient years ago who had an inner critic, and I said, do you think what's happening is that when you're under stress or you're upset, you internally reach for comfort, but your internalized comforter turned out to be a critic? So you're actually looking for relief, but what you internalized growing up was, instead of relief, what you got was criticism, and you internalized that. It became part of whatever happened. So anytime when you did something or you were upset, that other critic, your mom or your dad, would shame you, would tell you it's all your fault, but you internalize that that was the reaction. And so what happens is every time you get upset, you go back to this internalization of what you received. I'll share an anecdote with you that this patient may understand. There was a woman I was seeing years ago, a really high achiever, really dynamic, and probably had a lot of trouble with finding peace. And I remember there was a session I said to her, I said, I know what you're most afraid of, and it's not being criticized, judged, or pushed around verbally. She said, what? I said, you don't like those, but you know how to deal with them. You don't like them. I said, that's not what you're most afraid of. And she stuck her chin out. She said, what am I most afraid of? And again, I have this ability to look into people's eyes. And I looked in her eyes and I said, what you're most afraid of is feeling unconditionally safe and loved. And there's nothing you can do to lose it. And there's nothing you can do to earn it. And she paused. She teared up. And then she just collapsed sideways on the couch and just started sobbing. And then after several minutes, she got up. She seemed about 5 pounds heavier, lighter emotionally. And I said, what happened? And she said, you just hit a nerve below anything I can ever remember, but it's in there. And she said, you're absolutely right. I'm afraid of feeling that because there's so much pain that I never let myself really feel or go through, which is why I'm rigid. And so can you understand any of that?
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
So you might try, some of those things and just, you can even share this episode with that person. Although I want to share an insight with you that I've gotten recently, and this could be a whole other show. And it's about working on myself a little bit. What I discovered is when I wake up in the morning and I open my eyes, I'm not happy to see the day. As soon as I wake up, I often say to myself, oh, and you can fill in the blank, and it's not something, we can use we can use it on other channels, but I won't use it on yours. And so it was really interesting, and I'm glad we're having this interview, because today I was lying there, not wanting to get out of bed. And I like to try to figure out things that can help others and help me. And I'm lying there, and I said, what is going on? And then what I realized is the reason I have trouble getting out of bed is that I think every day I anticipate that I'm going to disappoint someone, I'm going to be disappointed in someone, or I'm going to be disappointed in myself because I have very high standards for myself. And so I'm anticipating, I don't know what's going to happen today, but someone's going to be disappointed in me because they need something immediately. I'm going to be disappointed in someone else because I'm maybe going to reach out for help and they say they can't help me. Or I'm going to be disappointed in myself and say, Mark, you're not a spring chicken. Can you ever fix this? And it was interesting because it clarified everything and it lifted those pressing thoughts. Because I said to myself, if it's just a matter of worrying about being disappointed to others, disappointed in others, or disappointed in myself, it gave me a vocabulary so that whenever I was feeling any of those things today, I was able to sort through it and say, okay, Mark, what are you disappointed about? Who's disappointed in you? Who are you disappointed in? And what are you disappointed in yourself about? And I'll tell you, it's been a very good day. It's been a very sane day.
I think that's very liberating, right? If you have the vocabulary and you have the ability to then process those emotions. And I think as medical practitioners, obviously, we're very demanding of our own selves and we have extremely high expectations of ourselves. And sometimes that can get the better of us.
Well, I'll tell you the hardest one for me. I don't like it. It's much easier for, me to deal with being disappointed in myself, because I have these standards. And, and I can deal with other people being disappointed in me. I have trouble being disappointed in other people. And you probably know, and your listeners don't know, but they're going to get a quick education, is I realize that I have trouble being disappointed in others because it opens up something called my shadow. And for people who don't know what that is, it's a Jungian, J-U-N-G, it's a Jungian term that basically says all of us have a dark side of our personality that we don't want to admit is there. Because if we admit those dark things, it can trigger us with guilt and shame. And it takes enormous energy to try to suppress those dark parts of our personality because they can fill us with shame. And so I think one of the reasons I have difficulty accepting my disappointment in others is because it crosses over into anger at them. It crosses over into being judgmental towards them. It crosses over into being petty. It crosses over into carrying grudge. Nobody sees me as having those qualities, and I'm not even consciously aware of them. But I think it takes an enormous energy to suppress them. And you're right, we medical doctors, we live to serve. And then when our patient doesn't follow the prescriptions, doesn't follow through, and then they come back and they're angry that nothing's working, and it's not working because they didn't follow through with what we suggested, we're human. So down deep, we're a bit upset. But we keep a lid on it because we're the doctor, they're the patient. But over time, I think that's what can cause burnout.
Yeah, and it reminds me of what we were talking about just earlier when I mentioned that so much of your approach in talking to crazy is giving people permission to have their darkest feelings and urges and ideas. And so you're also saying when we have to deal with our own crazy, that we have to give ourselves permission to have those dark feelings and ideas and urges as well.
Yeah, I think what it really comes down to is now that I've been working on these dark sides, as long as you don't act on them, I think we're good to go. I actually gave a sermon, and so let me tell you a little parable that they seem to like. And it was all about dealing with your shadow. And the sermon, the parable, which no one had ever heard of, and I heard it from someone else. The sermon is about the story where Jesus says to St. Thomas, Thomas, I want you to look after the pearly gates because St. Peter is away. And Thomas said, what do I do? And Jesus said, well, ask them about me. They seem to, talk to me a lot. They think about me. You'll be able to figure it out. And so 3 hours later, Jesus comes back and says, Thomas, how is it going? And Thomas said, I think I have it figured out. It's been like a Disney afternoon. There was a woman who came in and she was like the fairy godmother in Cinderella. And I said, who is Jesus? And she said, Jesus is beautiful. Jesus is love. He's kindness. And Jesus said to Thomas, what'd you do with her? And Thomas said, well, I let her through. And he said, did you see anyone else? And he said, well, I saw someone who was like Geppetto in Pinocchio, with the mustache and glasses. And I said, who is Jesus? And he said, Jesus is strong and just and fair. And Jesus said, what did you do with him? And Thomas said, well, I let him through. So Jesus says to Thomas, did you see anyone else? And Thomas said, it was like a Disney afternoon. I saw someone who was like a villain. He had a pointed hat, a pointed chin, a gold tooth. And I said, who is Jesus? And he said, Jesus is vindictive. Jesus is jealous. What'd you do with him? Thomas said, well, I sent him away. And then Jesus said to Thomas, but Thomas, that last person saw me exactly the way I am. What he failed to see is my daily effort to not be that way. So it's a parable about that we all have dark impulses. We all have dark thoughts, because that's what makes us human. And with that person with the inner critic, one of the reasons she's probably critical is that she probably received a lot of criticism, felt hurt, but on top of the hurt, she probably has a lot of anger and rage, and that's what makes her feel not worthwhile. Does that make sense? Because when we were feeling hurt, criticized, or abandoned, we weren't just feeling hurt and afraid, we were angry.
Right. And then we feel guilty for being angry, and that makes the criticism redouble.
That's right. So what we feel is if we can really realize that inside all of us is murderous rage, and we try to ignore it because it scares us and it shames us. One of the reasons we have critics and we don't feel good enough is not because we don't make enough money or we're not performing well. It's because we don't have enough goodness inside us to make up for the murderous rage.
Oh, that's very poignant.
Yeah, I think we all struggle with it. But if you can make friends with your shadow, by making friends, just accept it's there, that you're not a bad person if you're jealous of your best friend when good things happen to them. It's human.
Yeah, when I was reading your book, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of acceptance for people's shadow in the book, where when you're talking to these irrational people, you're counseling the people who are talking to them to be very accepting of all their darkness. And when these people felt accepted, they were able to stop being as irrational and engage in a more meaningful conversation.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how it works. If you can, there's another tip that I'll offer. So we gave them the tip about the reverse psychology, but something that other people have found helpful, and this works both ways. So if you're getting into an argument with someone, let them finish what they're saying, let them vent. And the tendency is to say to the person, and you could say this as a woman, a mother to your teenager, let them finish, and then don't try to calm them down. Don't try to scold them, but pause for 3 seconds, look them in the eye and say, you seem frustrated and I think you're holding back. And they're going to look at you like, what? And people will talk about being frustrated. If you say to someone, you're angry, they get defensive. But everybody will talk about frustration. And if you say to them, yeah, you seem frustrated and I think you're holding back, it totally flips them. And they're going to say, what do you mean? And you say, I think you're also upset and disappointed. So why don't you tell me what you're most frustrated, upset, and disappointed about? Let them vent and don't jump down their throat. Don't scold them. Pause for 3 minutes after they're venting, look them in the eye and say, you seem frustrated and I think you're holding back. That's going to totally flip them around because they're expecting you to be defensive, and they're going to say, I think you're holding back because I think you're upset and disappointed too. Why don't you tell me what you're frustrated, upset, and disappointed about so we can just get it out? And what you really want is for them to get all the frustration and upset out. Because when you start talking about disappointment, it's calmer. You can have almost, I'm not really frustrated or upset. What I really am is disappointed. But that can be a much more reasonable conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that tip very much. I think that's very helpful.
So talk about my new venture.
Yes, I'd love to talk about your new venture, which you said it was inspired by your new grandson.
Yeah, I have a grandson. He's 6 months old. It's my first grandchild. I wasn't close geographically to my grandparents, so I wasn't aware of the magical relationship between a grandparent and a grandchild. Because you're not responsible for them. I can turn them over to my daughter or son-in-law. But what's happening is my grandson and I were in a love fest with eye contact. I mean, I just look into his eyes and it's like looking into the eyes of God, I swear. And he's totally trusting. He's totally open. And I believe that he is imprinting. I believe young children, they look at their parents and they imprint. Is the world safe? Is the world dangerous? Should I trust the world? Should I not trust the world? And so as he looks at me, I want him to imprint that grandpa is joyful and happy as opposed to tired and sad. And so I came up with this notion that a friend of mine shared with me that he uses with his drug-using daughter, and it turned her around. He said he was getting tired of getting all the negative calls, and he was getting tired of being so resentful of his daughter that he started every day at 5 p.m. texting her, honey, what made you smile today?
Nice.
And at first, she was manipulative. And, because she didn't want to be positive. But he was positive because he was initiating the call as opposed to having to call her back after she was being manipulative. And so he just did it every day at 5 p.m. Honey, what made you smile today? And initially she'd say, well, I thought I'd get some money from you. And he said, no more money for your drug problems. We've already blown too much. But what made you smile? And so she got used to it. And then 6 weeks later, he texted her and said, what made you smile today? And she texted back, knowing that I'd get a text from you. And he started to cry. And then, a month later, she was off opiates. And so I can't say that this will, work with everyone. And so my initiative is called #WhatMadeYouSmileToday, WMYST, #WMYST. And here is the movement. And I'm going to be giving a TEDx talk on it. Every day, when I run into a person with a name tag, but who doesn't have a face, meaning they're a function, it's a cashier, it's a waiter, it's a TSA agent, but they have their first name on because they're supposed to be friendly. So every day, and I did it 6 times today, if a cashier rings me in and I see her name, and I saw one today, I say, "Thank you, Jackie," after she rang me in. I don't think anyone says that. I said, "Thank you, Jackie. My name's Mark. What made you smile today?" And she kind of flinched, and then she had this huge smile, and she said, "Just getting out of bed." And there was a woman next to us who was looking at this conversation, and I looked at her, and she said, and I said, "What about you?" And she said the same thing. And then they looked at me, and they said, "What made you smile?" And I said, "Are you kidding? The 2 smiles I just put on your face." And so part of the movement is we have wristbands that have hashtag WMYST with the website, which we'll develop, which is WMYST.com. And so the movement is you carry around wristbands and you run into someone like this, or you run into a person you introduce yourself, you say hello, and you say to them, "Hey, what made you smile today?" And you have to say it like you care about the answer. They'll pause and they will say things like, "Waking up, a beautiful day, my dog." One of my favorites at the TSA, it'll be often a woman, and she'll look at me and she'll say, "Seeing you, sweetie." So the movement is simply this. You then give them 2 wristbands and you say, "Here's 2 wristbands to remind you every day to do that. And why don't you give one to someone else?" And so that's what we're doing. We're growing a movement.
It's a wonderful movement. We're, focusing on positivity.
Yeah. And I'll tell you where it really helps, getting back to the shadow. Part of our shadow, and one of the reasons a lot of depressed people are depressed, is many of them feel a sense of shame that they're self-absorbed. Oh, all I care about is myself. And they feel real embarrassment. And so when you do this to someone that you get nothing from other than their smile, I'm telling you, it gets you out of your self-absorption. So they get to feel grateful. They get to relive something that made them happy. And you get to feel like, I brought a little happiness into the world. So that's the movement we're starting.
It's very empowering.
So we're hoping it'll spread. And what we're hoping to do is people will do selfies where they hold up their wristband and they'll say, "What made me smile today was seeing my grandma. What made me smile was such and such." And they can just share it. They'll hold up their wristband. They'll do a selfie. And then it'll end with saying to whoever's watching it, "What made you smile?" So we see that it could really spread.
I think when, we get so focused on all the bad things in our life that we forget that there are positive things, and especially people who have mental health issues, it can really become a habit, right, of negativity. So that can definitely kind of break that wiring.
Yeah, I tell you, like my friend said, he said, "My daughter is a drug addict, but something made her smile. I mean, maybe she had a slice of pizza. Maybe she scored some good drugs. I don't know. Maybe she had a shower for the first time in a week." And he just said, there's got to be something that made her smile. And he was just tired of hearing all her negativity.
It's fantastic. Well, that's very inspiring. And I just wanted to end with you giving a little call to action. Well, first, before you do that, where can people find you? And then I'd love to hear a little call to action from you for the listeners.
If you go to markgoulston.com, MarkGoulston.com, that's my website. There'll be a Facebook page for WMYST in the near future, and there'll be a website for WMYST also. Here's a call to action. Suicide still touches me because I was a suicide specialist for 25 years. On my Twitter page, at Mark Goulston, MarkGoulston, I have permanently pinned a tweet that says, "Do you know of anyone who died by suicide in your community?" And it has 2.5 million impressions and over 30,000 engagements, and it's saving lives. And it is chilling because you start to read people listing all the people they know who have died by suicide, and your heart goes out to them. But if you've been touched by suicide, you'll feel less alone. Also, something you might check out, I have 2 podcasts. One's called My Wakeup Call, where I interview people, and I'm going to have you on, about what matters to them most in life and their journey and wake-up calls to discovering that. And I've interviewed people like Larry King and Norman Lear and Esther Wojcicki. One of her daughters is the CEO of YouTube, and the other is the CEO of 23andMe. And these are just wonderful people being totally open, like kind of our conversation is. And then I have another podcast called Stay Alive, in which I interview people who've been touched by suicide. They've made attempts. They've lost children. It's a real tough listen, but that's saving lives too, because a lot of people who are touched by suicide feel isolated. So you can check those out as well.
That's really excellent resources for the listeners, for sure. Well, I really want to thank you for coming on the podcast today. The things you're talking about are so meaningful and inspirational and just important. And it was really a pleasure chatting with you.
Well, it was a real pleasure. And what's not going to make someone smile is cleaning up and editing this thing.
That was the brilliant Dr. Mark Goulston, and I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. If you like this podcast, please review it on iTunes, and you can sign up for my free monthly wellness newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll also learn about my new online course, How to Handle Difficult People Once and for All.